Thanks for watching. The Great War truly changed warfare forever. Not just on the ground, where soldiers fought and died in muddy trenches, victims of new mechanized inventions, or at sea where Europe's massive navies clashed. Machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas, artillery, dreadnoughts, and of course tanks, all saw their first major implementations during World War I. All the while, a new front had developed in the sky, a battle for air superiority. The first war in the sky began just 11 years after the Wright brothers' invention. This is the story of aerial combat in World War I. Before I begin this video, I'd like to say a special thanks to 1C Games, who provided me with a copy of Flying Circus Volume 1 for the making of this video, but more on that later. In the early stages of the war, in 1914, most of Europe's army generals, especially the more senior members, were skeptical of the usefulness of aircraft in war. Quickly, though, they saw the usefulness of planes in the field of reconnaissance, as more traditional scouts on horseback were getting mowed down by machine guns. Not only were the planes in less danger of being shot down, but they were also logically able to observe larger surfaces and travel longer distances more quickly. At the outbreak of the war, France, Russia, and Germany were the only nations to have a considerable air force. The German army, though, mainly relied on Zeppelins, whilst French and Russians had built up a considerable collection of aeroplanes. Albeit the Russian selection was more antiquated. On top of that, most belligerent nations also used observation balloons. The first big success enjoyed by reconnaissance planes was during the invasion of France on the 22nd of August 1914, when British Captain Charlton and Lieutenant Wadham reported the German army under General Kluck was preparing an encircling maneuver which would have led to the death or capture of the British Expeditionary Force. In turn, the simple act of reconnaissance managed to save the lives of over 100,000 soldiers. Reconnaissance airplanes proved themselves once again in the Battle of the Marne, where gaps in the German lines were found, which the Entente could exploit. As you probably know, the Battle of the Marne was the turning point of the early war in Western Europe. These events proved once again the potential and usefulness of planes in warfare. As a result, more if not most belligerent nations sought to upscale their aerial operations. When it came to reconnaissance aircraft, observation balloons had already been employed in many wars prior and were used throughout the Great War. They were mainly used for spotting targets and calculating the range for artillery guns. It is important to note that these balloons were never abandoned during the war and remained valuable assets throughout. Observation balloons would usually be set up a few miles from the front lines and were heavily guarded by anti-aircraft guns to keep away fighters and machine guns on the ground to deter infantry. Sometimes there were even fighters patrolling the surrounding area of the observation balloons. Due to these fortifications, attacking an observation balloon was considered a very dangerous task. Nevertheless, many pilots enjoyed the challenge of sending these balloons to the ground in a blaze. Pilots with a distinct talent for downing these balloons were nicknamed balloon busters, the most successful balloon buster being Willy Coppens, Friedrich Ritter, von Rude, Frank Luke, and Leon Buschard, just to name a few. A little-known fact about these observation balloons was that the crews were the first to be equipped with parachutes. Pilots and Zeppelin crews started using these parachutes shortly thereafter. Back to the topic of reconnaissance planes. The first planes used in the Great War were used solely for reconnaissance and were quite primitive at best. Most of them were quite slow with top speeds of around 100 km/h or 60 miles per hour, had open cockpits and lacked any navigational tools, which led to pilots getting lost on a regular basis. Early on there were some instances of pilots who would land in fields and ask locals for directions, or pilots who flew low by train tracks to read the station signs to find out where they were. Before the development of proper aerial cameras, it wasn't uncommon for pilots to land close to the nearest commander and convey his findings verbally. This, as you can probably imagine, wasn't terribly accurate, and attempts were made to equip planes with cameras and direct means of communication. For a time, the pilots tried to take photographs from the sky. These photographs were often of poor quality and couldn't really be used. For a short period, the idea of having a crew of 2 on reconnaissance planes circled. 1 pilot and 1 camera operator. This also proved impractical as a camera operator had to fiddle about and switch out delicate glass lenses and required the pilot to fly very steadily. As a result of these poor methods, a direct solution had to be found, and in 1913 the first aerial cameras were developed. They were pioneered by Germany and remained superior throughout the war. Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, also profited from these advances. The French, and on a much smaller scale the British, followed suit. These aerial cameras were pointed vertically to the ground and were often fixed to the side of the cockpit outside of the plane and could be operated by the pilot. Some planes also had a seat for a designated aerial camera operator. These provided a much better image quality and were overall more effective. At the outbreak of the war, the most common planes in the sky were the French Blériot, the German Tauber, the British Royal Aircraft Factory B-2C, and the Russian Lebed 7. Reconnaissance planes stayed in service throughout the war and were seen as valuable targets by fighters. In fact, more than half of the Red Baron's victories were against reconnaissance aircraft. The most effective reconnaissance planes of the war proved to be the German Rumpler C-7, which distinguished itself with the ability to fly long distances and reach high altitudes of up to 6,400 meters. The British RE-8, the German Junkers J-1, which specialized in flying low as it was the first fully metal-constructed armored airplane which could withstand small arms fire from the battlefield. The Russian 4-engine Sikorsky Ilya Muromets, which had exceptional range, the French Farman MF, and Berger, and last but not least arguably the best reconnaissance plane of the entire war. The Ansaldo SVA-5, which could reach speeds of up to 230 kilometers per hour, or 140 miles per hour. The sheer speed of this plane made it nearly impossible for enemy fighters to intercept. On top of its impressive speed, it could also climb up to 6,000 kilometers or 20,000 feet. It had an impressive range of 650 kilometers or 430 miles. This allowed the plane to cross the Alps into Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Zeppelin, named after Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, also saw wide usage during the Great War. Mainly on the side of Germany, though. Throughout the war, they were used for reconnaissance and bombing. The bombing itself wasn't terribly effective, and was to a large extent carried out over London and other civilian locations. Despite being an appalling war crime, it proved to be relatively useless, as only few resources had to be diverted from the front lines and only served to terrorize the British populace. Zeppelins were susceptible to small arms fire, anti-aircraft artillery, and fighter planes. If they weren't at high altitudes, there would be more often than not shot down by ground forces. On the whole, Zeppelins weren't terribly useful and were only really good for reconnaissance, if anything. Despite being invented fairly recently, World War I would mark the end of military Zeppelin usage. In the very early phases of the war, hostile reconnaissance planes would cross each other with nothing more than a wave or a smile. As the war progressed and the situation on the ground got more serious, the relationship between rival pirates got increasingly more hostile. Pilots started throwing stones, grenades, and even grappling hooks at each other. Hilariously enough, all these methods proved unsurprisingly useless. The first incident in which a plane was downed by another enemy plane occurred on the 8th of September, 1914, in the skies of Galicia, when Russian pilot Pyotr Nesterov decided to ram a rival Austrian reconnaissance. This resulted, as expected by many, in both aircraft crashing and everyone on board perishing. Pilots also began carrying sidearms, like the Mauser or the Nagant revolver, with which they would aim to shoot down enemy flyers. These proved to be much too imprecise. Rifles, while more accurate, fired too slowly to be effective in the air. On October 5, 1914, a French pilot named Louis Canon attached a machine gun to his aircraft and shot at a German plane. While he failed to destroy the enemy aircraft, the age of aerial combat had officially commenced. Aircraft manufacturers then hurried to discover a practical method for mounting machine guns onto planes. Numerous planes with 2 seats had machine guns fixed to the rear of the aircraft, operated by the second crew member. This offered a decent defensive measure and not much more, as it required the pilot to fly alongside or in front of an enemy aircraft, which was not exactly an easy maneuver. It became evident that machine guns needed to face the direction of travel to be truly useful, since all pilots would then need to do is steer their plane towards their opponent. In this manner, the aircraft could actively fire upon the one it was chasing. This also removed the necessity for a dedicated gunner, as a pilot could manage both the machine gun and the aircraft's controls. Early attempts at forward-facing machine guns involved mounting them on the upper wings of biplanes, operated either by the pilot or a gunner. While this was a significant improvement, these aircraft had several notable drawbacks. If the pilot was responsible for firing the gun, they would have to release at least one hand from the control stick. The machine gun's aim would also not align with what the pilot was facing, compelling them to dip their aircraft slightly and estimate the proper angle. Accomplishing that while pursuing a moving target was exceedingly challenging. Another issue that arose was related to reloading and clearing malfunctions. If a gun jammed or required reloading, it was quite difficult to reach while seated for a single pilot, and standing up was not the ideal approach. To address this, designs were created where the gun could be lowered to the pilot on a track. Although an enhancement, this still wasn't the perfect resolution. Machine guns mounted on the top wings operated by gunners presented the issue that the gunner often had to stand to operate the weapon. Now, you can likely envision the complications that occur when pursuing an aircraft performing evasive maneuvers. The other challenge gunners encountered was the limited firing zone available to them. A propeller could easily obstruct their line of fire. And perhaps the most apparent disadvantage of having a gunner was the additional burden of the gunner themselves and their station, the logical outcome of which is reduced speed and agility. An alternative strategy for mounting machine guns involved using pusher-type aircraft. The British arms company Vickers had been exploring potential solutions since 1912. They produced a prototype known as the Vickers Experimental Fighting Biplane 1, a memorable name I know, and many other prototypes during the war. These prototypes were configured as pusher planes. This configuration means the engine is situated behind the pilot, facing backward, and propels the aircraft forward, similar to the Wright brothers' design. The opposite arrangement is a tractor type, where the engine is positioned in front of the pilot, pulling the aircraft. The advantage of the pusher configuration was an ideal position for the machine guns, completely free from propeller interference and allowing for direct aiming with the aircraft. The primary drawback of this aircraft type was its diminished performance. Pusher aircraft were considerably slower than tractor planes with identical engines. This was primarily due to the extra weight needed to balance the engine in the plane's center and shifting the center of gravity to a less advantageous spot. These pusher fighters were utilized until 1917, with models like the FE-2D, but became outdated due to their low speed, making them incapable of intercepting their targets. They belonged to an era where visibility was prioritized over speed in fighter aircraft. It wasn't until 1943 that pusher planes experienced a resurgence with the Swedish Saab J-21. Finally, aircraft manufacturers aimed to install their machine guns between the pilot and the propeller on a pusher-type aircraft, making aiming, firing, and reloading the machine gun significantly easier, and also simplifying jam clearing and stoppages, all without sacrificing speed. The sole issue was the propeller. Discharging the machine gun through a propeller carried the risk of shattering the propeller itself, or a bullet ricocheting back towards the pilot, the engine, or other components of the aircraft, all of which would naturally prove extremely problematic. In April 1915, the Maurer-Solnier Company assembled a prototype aircraft with deflector blades, which were essentially armored propeller blades with angled plating designed to deflect incoming bullets away from the propeller. The French pilot Roland Garraud tested this in combat and even achieved several aerial victories. Garrod was compelled to land behind enemy lines mid-flight due to engine trouble, which was likely caused by shrapnel from bullets, or possibly even bullets entering the aircraft's engine. Shortly after landing, Garrod and his aircraft were apprehended by the German military. The German High Command promptly transferred the captured aircraft to the German aviation manufacturer Fokker, who had already been developing similar prototypes. Fokker received orders from German High Command to replicate the design. However, the deflector system proved completely incompatible with German steel-jacketed ammunition. This prompted Fokker's engineers to re-examine the concept of synchronizing the propeller with the machine gun. This mechanism would only permit the machine gun to fire when the bullet had no chance of striking the propeller. Consequently, in the spring of 1915, they unveiled the Fokker EI fighter, which incorporated the Stangensteuerung system, which was indeed an interrupter. A synchronizer, despite being rather average in most respects apart from its firing mechanism. Fokker, having validated their concept, standardized the design and initiated mass production under the designation Fokker EI, with E signifying Eindecker. Germany also took steps to establish dedicated fighter units, known as Kampfeinsitzerkommando, or KEK for short. I'm not exaggerating. They were established at various points along the Western Front and served as a form of aerial defense. In March 1916, German aerial strategist Oswald Bolk proposed the idea of utilizing forward-facing observers. These aircraft patrolled close to the front lines, actively searching for approaching Entente planes. These new tactics and fighters ushered in a period of German air dominance, and both proved to be overall successful. The Entente referred to this period as the Fokker Scourge. These Eindeckers inflicted heavy losses on Entente reconnaissance aircraft and compelled the Entente to upgrade their air forces. You might question why they didn't simply mount machine guns on the sides of the wings, as seen in most WW2 aircraft. Well, there are numerous reasons for this. The primary one being that early machine guns frequently experienced jams and stoppages. Positioning them near the pilot also allowed for mid-air reloading. Mounting machine guns on the wings also presented challenges with aiming, as the guns would need to be set at an angle where the bullets would converge at a specific distance. Maintaining that optimal firing zone was an additional difficulty with this design approach. By the end of 1915, Germany, bolstered by its superior aircraft and pilot training, had achieved air superiority. Possessing such a technological edge helped cultivate many of the very first flying aces. Aces were pilots credited with 5 or more aerial victories. Aerial victories required confirmation and witnessing by another pilot. Otherwise, they were not officially counted. The term was popularized by the French in reference to pilot Adolphe Bourgeot. These aces were celebrated by the press and propaganda, likened to knights of old, to portray the war as more honorable and less grim and pointless than trench warfare. The most accomplished flying aces of the war included Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, who achieved a total of 80 aerial victories, making him the most successful pilot of the conflict. France's René Fonck, with 75 confirmed victories, although he claimed to have downed 142. This makes Fonck the most accomplished pilot ever on the Allied side. And lastly, Canada's Billy Bishop, with 72 victories, establishing him as the most successful pilot in the history of the RAF and the British Empire. This German air superiority, in some instances, had significant consequences on the ground battlefield. For example, at the Battle of Verdun, the German army achieved a substantial surprise over the French forces, as the French Air Force could no longer effectively monitor German troop movements. For instance, at the Battle of Verdun, the German army was able to achieve a mighty surprise over the French, since the French Air Force was no longer able to track German troop movements. Many of you probably know that the French forces faced heavy losses during the Battle of Boudin. However, later in the conflict, France managed to reclaim control of the skies. Fortunately, the Entente situation began to improve, thanks to the development and introduction of the British two-seater FE-2B pusher aircraft, and the single-seat DH-2 in September 1915. These aircraft were part of the Royal Air Corps and could fire forward without propeller synchronization. These planes finally gave the Entente a match for the German Fokker E-1. The French Aéronautique Militaire also responded with the Nieuport 11 in January 1915, a tractor design that mounted its gun externally clear of the propeller. With these new aircraft, the Entente finally regained air superiority prior to the Battle of the Somme in June 1916, putting an end to the Fokker dominance and maintaining control of the air until the battle's conclusion. The primary objective for most of these fighters was to bring down enemy reconnaissance aircraft and safeguard their own reconnaissance planes. While not the most glorious task, this was tactically more significant than shooting down another enemy fighter. As previously noted, fighters were also utilized to protect and engage observation balloons and bombers. Strafing trenches with machine gun fire was also a common tactic, as defenses against aircraft were quite basic and ineffective at that time. A growing trend for all aircraft involved a shift in maneuverability and stability. For those of you with some familiarity with aircraft engineering, you might understand that greater stability in an aircraft generally means less maneuverability. During the war's initial stages, stable aircraft were favored by the high command of Europe's air forces, as stable planes were considerably easier to pilot, and most pilots at the time had limited training before combat deployment. In some instances, they had only 3 to 4 hours of flying experience. By the war's end, this situation evolved significantly, with aircraft becoming more agile, which was crucial and could be the difference between survival and death in aerial combat. Successfully outmaneuvering an opponent could often determine a pilot's destiny. The trade-off for enhancing aircraft maneuverability was reduced stability. More agile planes were more prone to stalling and entering a dangerous spiral. Having lost their air superiority, Germany focused again on innovating its air force and aircraft designs. To reform Germany's air arm, known as the Fliegertruppen des Deutschen Reichs, the German Air Force underwent a complete reorganization under Oswald Bolk into the Luftstreitkräfte. This new entity adopted a more defensive approach to compensate for Germany's numerical disadvantage. This restructuring was finalized in October 1916. The reorganization paved the way for the first German strategic bombing units and close support squadrons, known as Schlagstaffeln, which translates to battle squadrons. These formations presented considerable challenges to the British. At the Battle of Cambrai and during the German Spring Offensive of 1918, a remarkable aspect of Germany's revamped air force was its new Justice, or Jagdstaffeln, meaning fighter squadrons. These Justice adhered to Bolk's 8 guiding principles for fighter pilots. The Dicta Bolk. Whenever possible, attack from above or with the sun behind you to gain the advantage before engaging. Commit to an attack once it has been initiated. Only engage at close range and when the target is securely in your sights. Keep your focus on your adversary and be wary of deceptive maneuvers. When attacking, prioritize pursuing your opponent from behind. If your opponent dives toward you, fly to meet them rather than evading. While in enemy territory, always be mindful of your escape route. It is preferable to attack in groups of 4 or 6. If a formation disperses into individual engagements, ensure no single target is attacked by multiple fighters. Among Bolk's closest pupils, his cubs, with whom he personally flew into combat, was the most famous aviator of all time. This was the legendary Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron. Following Bolk's demise, the Red Baron took command of Jasta 11, whose moniker you are likely more familiar with, the Flying Circus. This designation stemmed from the vibrant colors adorning the squadron's aircraft. During the Great War, aircraft were highly conspicuous and did not require camouflage. To enhance mutual recognition and identification, each aircraft in Jasta 11 featured a distinctive paint scheme. These paint schemes were frequently bold and eye-catching, with the Red Baron's aircraft notably painted bright red, earning him his other moniker, der Rote Kampfflieger. Richthofen welcomed this distinction, as he desired both enemies and allies to identify him in the air and on the ground. The sight of the Red Baron's Crimson Albatros was a terrifying spectacle for rookie RFC pilots. In the initial period of the Justice, they were equipped with Halberstadt D2S, Germany's inaugural biplane. Shortly after, Germany introduced a new series of synchronized tractor biplanes, the Fokker D series. These new biplanes were making a significant impression in the skies due to their improved handling and firepower. The Albatros D1 was the first aircraft to feature a formidable dual machine gun configuration, and was operated by the Red Baron. Later, older models were also retrofitted with this enhanced armament. The new generation of aircraft was well on its way to restoring German air supremacy. It is important to note that the new Luftstreitkräfte still employed aerial patrol tactics, with reconnaissance aircraft on patrol spotting enemy planes and relaying their positions to ground command. This strategy helped preserve the condition of their pilots and aircraft, as they were only deployed when absolutely necessary. By early 1917, the Justice were dominating the skies and causing considerable trouble for the Entente aircraft. During the first half of 1917, the RFC experienced substantially higher losses than Germany. However, it was also during this period that the first Entente synchronized tractor fighters began entering service, such as the Sopwith-Pup, Sopwith-Triplane, and Spad S-7. These aircraft faced disadvantages, though, as they were far fewer in number than their German counterparts and possessed inferior firepower, being equipped with only a single machine gun compared to the now standard German twin-gun setup. At that time, the Entente still operated numerous two-seater squadrons with aircraft like the B-2E, which were poorly suited for air-to-air combat. This imbalance in aerial strength, coupled with Germany's new Albatros D3 and the RFC's offensive strategy versus the Luftstreitkräfte's defensive posture, culminated in what became known as Bloody April. During this month, the RFC suffered devastating losses, losing approximately 1/4 of its operational strength. In Bloody April, the RFC lost 245 aircraft, with 211 airmen killed or missing and 108 taken prisoner. Meanwhile, the Germans lost only 66 aircraft, resulting in a 4-to-1 kill ratio favoring the Germans. That month, the life expectancy for a replacement British pilot was a mere 11 days. During Bloody April, Jasta 11 achieved a total of 89 aerial victories, with the Red Baron alone accounting for 21, including 4 in a single day. Despite these severe casualties, the RFC still fulfilled its mission of providing up-to-date intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, and artillery spotting. Although catastrophic for the RFC, these actions significantly aided the troops on the ground. It is also noteworthy that much of Bloody April took place over German territory. Following Bloody April, air superiority shifted away from the Germans once more, returning to British hands. With the mass production of new aircraft such as the British legendary Sopwith Camel, the SE-5A, and the French Spad S-13, all equipped with twin forward-firing machine guns, the Entente could finally match the German planes. The two-seater category also saw new models like the RE-8, FK-8, and Bristol F-2B, which, while not exceptional, performed considerably better than their outdated predecessors. The Sopwith Camel alone is a rather distinctive aircraft. It utilized a rotary engine that operated in reverse, so to speak, compared to a conventional engine. Instead of the engine being fixed to the aircraft with only the propeller rotating, the engine and propeller spun in unison, causing the entire engine assembly to rotate. Spinning such a substantial mass had a noticeable impact on the aircraft's handling characteristics. Rolling the aircraft with the engine engaged was quicker and caused the nose to pitch downwards, and rolling the aircraft and fall into the hands of the British. With the mass production of new planes like the British, the legendary Sopwith Camel, the SE-5A, and the French Spad S-13, all of which were equipped with twin front-facing machine guns, the Entente could finally match the German planes. This two-seater, the category also saw new planes like the RE-8, FK, 8 and Bristol F-2B, which were still truly brilliant, but they performed much better than their outdated predecessors. The SOP with Camel alone is a pretty unique plane. It used a rotary engine which works in reverse, so to say, to a regular engine. Rather than attaching the engine to the plane and only having the propeller spin, the engine and propeller would spin together, making the whole engine spin with the propeller. Spinning this much mass made a significant difference in the way the plane handled. Rolling the plane with the engine made it go faster and push the nose down, and rolling the plane it responded more slowly, causing the nose to lift. Experienced pilots could find these traits very useful. However, the RFC was more concerned with statistics, meaning they consistently had more novice pilots than seasoned ones. This particular engine did, though, offer a superior power-to-weight ratio and torque compared to other designs. Power-to-weight ratio and torque superior to other designs. Meanwhile, German manufacturers churned out an increasing number of disappointing aircraft, such as the Albatros D5, the Pfalz D3, and notably, the Fokker DR1. While the DR1 is likely the most recognizable aircraft of the Great War, and indeed one of the most recognizable planes ever in that respect, bore many structural problems which were mainly manifested in the wings of the aircraft. Nevertheless, the plane did offer an exceptionally fast roll rate. Wings of the plane. What the plane did provide, however, was a very fast roll rate. By dividing its wing surface into 3 sections, it enabled a shorter wingspan. This design reduced the moment of inertia, thereby enhancing maneuverability. However, this came at a price. With additional wings, drag increased, consequently placing more stress on the wings themselves. More stable wing material. This is exactly what the DR1 lacked, leading to many structural failures in midair. The reason for the Fokker DR1's iconic status stems from its distinct design and the association with the famed Red Baron. Many mistakenly believe this was the Baron's primary aircraft. This couldn't be further from the truth, though. Richthofen's main throughout the conflict. His main aircraft were the Albatros D2 and D3. Richthofen secured only 19 of his 80 aerial victories in the DR1. Furthermore, it was in this aircraft that the Red Baron was shot down. So, in general, it was far from being the war's greatest aircraft. Following Russia's withdrawal from the war in March of 1918, Germany initiated what became known as the German Spring Offensive on March 21st, launching numerous assaults against the British, hoping to defeat them and compel the French, whom they viewed as mutinous, to surrender before America could properly enter the fray. Unfortunately for Germany, however, the new Fokker D7 couldn't reach the front lines in sufficient quantities, leaving the German Jagdstaffeln at a technological disadvantage. Thanks to meticulous planning, however, these initial offensives achieved success, resulting in record territorial gains for Germany on the ground since 1914. Around the time of the Red Baron's demise on April 21st, most of these advances had once again stalled. Despite destroying numerous British airfields, this April also saw the Royal Flying Corps separate from the Royal Navy, establishing the Royal Air Force, the world's first autonomous air service. In this later stage of the war, Germany continued producing new models like the Fokker Pfalz in Holland, but struggled to deploy and manufacture them in large numbers due to supply constraints within the Central Powers. The Volto oil they were forced to use instead of the standard castor oil drastically reduced the lifespan and reliability of the plane. Still producing new models like the Fokker Pfalz in Holland, but was becoming increasingly engines. At this point, the Entente maintained its air superiority, largely due to its numerical advantage. When America ultimately entered the war in 1917, its aircraft were highly outdated, and American squadrons primarily utilized surplus Entente planes, which were often also somewhat obsolete. This meant that an American pilot's odds weren't exactly favorable. However, with time, they would be equipped with aircraft comparable to their allies, enabling them to hold their own in aerial combat. Toward the war's conclusion, it was the Americans, supported by the British, French, and Italians, who spearheaded the largest aerial operation of the war at the Battle of St. Quentin. With 701 fighters, 366 reconnaissance planes, 323 daytime bombers, and 91 nighttime bombers. The Battle of St. Quentin, launching the war's largest aerial operation. Right up until the November 11th armistice, the Entente maintained its air superiority. Now, regarding bombers. During the Great War, the significance of bombers wasn't as substantial as one might assume. Fighters and reconnaissance aircraft proved to be more critical throughout the conflict overall. The earliest form of bombing involved pilots dropping objects from their planes, aiming to strike enemy troops below. In the very initial phases of the war, reports mention pilots throwing items like bricks, grenades, and even large steel projectiles known as flechettes at the soldiers below. Early bombers were a blend of reconnaissance and bomber types, making them easy targets for enemy fighters, but they soon evolved into a distinct category of aircraft. These early bombers often had 2 crew members, and despite being slow and somewhat lacking in maneuverability, they possessed the unique advantage of being able to fire both forward and backward. These bombers, on the other hand, presented formidable targets for fighters, as approaching them from the rear exposed you directly to the rear gunner's line of fire. The task of bombing was long dominated by Zeppelins, but with the advent of aircraft like the Gotthard G bomber and the Zeppelin Starken R-7 giant 4-engine bombers, this role began to shift. The Entente also developed its own bomber designs, the most well-known likely being the British Handley Page 0400 biplane bomber, capable of carrying bomb loads up to 900 kilograms, which was an impressive payload for aircraft of that era. It also flew at speeds up to 156 kilometers per hour and could sustain flight for up to 8 hours. On the whole, bombers were not exceptionally effective and were typically employed for tactical strikes on crucial military and civilian logistical infrastructure. Air defenses and anti-aircraft artillery also saw significant advancements during the Great War. The aerial warfare of the First World War fundamentally transformed combat and, along with tanks, would shape Blitzkrieg in the Second World War, as well as every major conflict thereafter. Never again would aircraft experience such rapid and extensive technical progress in such brief time spans. Post-Great War, aircraft became indispensable in every military force and remain so today, with the names of those who piloted these machines forever immortalized. Well, if you've reached this point in the video, I sincerely appreciate you watching, and a special thank you goes to 1C Games. If you have a strong interest in aircraft from the latter stages of the Great War, I definitely recommend Flying Circus Volume 1. The game features 13 highly detailed warplanes with very accurate flight physics, 2 narrative-driven campaigns, single-player and multiplayer modes, VR compatibility, and additionally, a vast 10,000 square kilometer map of the Aarhus region, including towns like Cambrai. If this sounds appealing to you, I've included links to purchase this game in the description. These links are not affiliated. If you found this video enjoyable, please consider leaving a rating and subscribing for upcoming content. Feel free to share the video with others who might find the topic interesting. If you have any specific content requests for the future, please do me the favor of letting me know in the comments. In the description for this video, you'll find links to other related videos that I strongly recommend you view. And once again, thank you for watching. Pilots began by tossing stones, grenades, and even grappling hooks at each other, quite humorously, when Russian pilot Pyotr Nesterov decided to deliberately collide with a rival Austrian reconnaissance aircraft. Pilots started throwing stones, grenades, and even grappling hooks at each other hilariously. Enough when Russian pilot Pyotr Nesterov decided to ram a rival Austrian reconnaissance aircraft.